Okay, we're going to try to wrap up James chapter 2 today, maybe get into chapter 3 as well. We'll pick up in verse 18 and read through the end of the chapter. But someone may well say, you have faith and I have works. Show me your faith without the works, and I will show you my faith by my works. You believe that God is one, you do well. The demons also believe and shudder. But are you willing to recognize, you foolish fellow, that faith without works is useless? Was not Abraham our father justified by works when he offered up Isaac his son on the altar? You see that faith was working with his works, and as a result of the works, faith was perfected. And the scripture was fulfilled, which says, and Abraham believed God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. And he was called the friend of God. You see that a man is justified by works and not by faith alone. In the same way was not Rahab the harlot also justified by works when she received the messengers and sent them out by another way? For just as the body without the spirit is dead, so also faith without works is dead. What do we think about that? Sherry's tuning in. Hello, Sherry. Ladies first, Robert. Come on now. Okay. Okay, that's good. Yes, sir.
18 down through 21, there's so much in it. Faith works. The demons believe in shudder. I mean, just a lot of times, just about one or two sentences there, really thinking about what we're being told. So, a lot of times, you think that somebody that is like a demon, really bad, et cetera, might not believe in God. Saying here that believe. That's kind of a anti what we think about a demon. Somebody that so they can God and have no faith or belief or understanding of God. But in here it says that's not the case.
When the ministry of Christ, people possessed by demons were sometimes quick to identify Jesus by who he was. They knew who he was, maybe when nobody else there knew who he was. So it's, the spiritual world, the spiritual realm is maybe to some extent knows its own. Not that they're the same, but they are working on a similar plane, in a similar origin. So, excuse me, it's a interesting play on words, especially in our context, because when we look, and maybe me drawn from James when we do this, when we look at the word faith and what faith is, most of us would say that faith is not simply belief. It's not simply a mental acknowledgement of something, that it takes more than that for it to really be faith. And James talks about faith, and then he does talk about it in terms of mere belief. The demons believe. They have some capacity of faith, in a sense. But their works reflect, they're not what they're supposed to be happening. So it's an interesting little turn of phrase there, at least, especially in our context, where we maybe encounter and argue with, or I know nobody here is very argumentative, so that wouldn't happen, I guess, but discuss theological finer points of our faith, and we may discuss particularly those who do not see the need for things like baptism in order to be a Christian. And we've talked about this a little bit. And there was a time in history where nobody was an unbaptized believer. That just didn't exist. And now we have people who are believers, I guess, but are not baptized. And I think it's, again, to some extent, a reflection on us in that we have made in our own hearts and our own minds baptism a work rather than a gift that is received. And, if you think about it, when a mother nurses her child, the child is receiving what it needs. But yes, they're eating, but really it's simply the mother supplying the need, isn't it? They're receiving what the mother is giving the child. And I think we can kind of look like that, look at our relationship with God as simply receiving what we need from God. So.
Food, but it's also the comfort of mother love. In my mind, you were talking
Yes.
about it, it's really a very good example of the way our relationship with God probably should be.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that God supplies us with His love, His concern, His on and on and on. The Lord's Supper, the baptism, the songs, prayers we do, but yet there's more. There's even more than that.
Well, I think it's kind of a natural human tendency, particularly in our culture. Maybe not. Maybe it hasn't been around forever, but it has been, at least probably since the Enlightenment, to categorize everything, to compartmentalize everything, to put this is this and this is that, and these two things, this is the church and this is the state, and the two should never meet one another. And those are helpful up to a point in some regards. But at the same time, God is our God and gives us life in a holistic manner, every aspect of our life. And as you mentioned, the nursing of a child is not simply the way to provide nourishment to the child, physical nourishment. There is an emotional component to it. There is just a bonding that goes on between mother and child. And you can say that about other aspects, other relationships that we have with people where it's not intended. I don't think marriage is intended to be simply an arrangement by which two people acquire property, have children, reproduce, and, that's it. There's still two individuals. Two become one. I think that takes time for it to be thorough. They become more one as time goes on, and maybe the physical coupling diminishes as time goes on. Maybe it doesn't. To salute, but if the physical coupling may diminish, but the emotional and the investment in each other's lives, and we see what Mark and Karen are going through right now, and you see that what happens to Mark directly affects Karen. You can't do something to Mark and not affect Karen. And and yet when a married couple that's been together for a really long time and one of them passes away, the other one still has to kind of go on. And sometimes they don't go on very long or very well, but it's still the two that are one. And so when the one is gone, the other one is still, so hopefully when people in our group go through the process of becoming widowed, they can find a new purpose in life. That their widowhood is a status, whether they're widows, widow women, as my dad called them, or they're widowers. They can see this as a new phase of life that God can use them, perhaps in a way in their widowhood that they could not be used as a married person. So, but that gets us back, I guess, to what James is trying to do, I think, is just try to get us to look at our relationship with God holistically, rather than argumentatively, or rather than compartmentalized faith and works being separate from each other, and that they can coexist. If they are severed, if they are not working together, that's what happens with the demons. You're following along with the demons rather than you're the ones we're supposed to be following. So that is, it's quite ungodly to try to separate the two. So this is, to some extent, maybe a straw man argument, but I think James is just anticipating the response. Maybe he's anticipating a response from someone who's read Paul. Maybe he's anticipating the response from Paul, because James, if this is the James we think it is, James and Paul knew each other and encountered some things and maybe had different responses to things at times. He goes to some very well-known Old Testament examples, and it's interesting. The man is Abraham, and when you go with Abraham, you're going to the father of the faith, aren't you? You're going back to there were humans that I guess followed the God of Abraham before Abraham. Noah, in a way, I think Noah just he certainly built the ark, so I guess you could say he followed, but we trace our faith, and the Jewish people trace their faith, and the Islamic people even trace their faith to Abraham. He is the father of their faith, our faith. So you could say the father of three faiths. So he's kind of a big deal. And we know, when you look at it not too long ago, when we were going through Genesis, Abraham was not perfect. Not every work he did was a reflection of really strong faith, was it? It's not really strong faith to give Sarah up because you're scared of what's going to happen. That's not a great work of faith. It's not really, at one point, not a great expression of faith to suggest or come to a realization that your servant is going to be your heir rather than the child that God has promised you. But I guess you could say it is a great act of faith, and this is, I think, what James is talking about. It is great act of faith that once that child has been given to you, you're willing to sacrifice that child to God as you're called upon. It is certainly a great act of faith to receive a calling from God to leave everything behind and go and follow him. I mean, there are great acts of faith, but that faith is demonstrated at times in what he works. Faith and fear just coexist in Abraham.
Well, he's human.
He's human. And faith and fear coexist in us as well. And sometimes the fear wins out. I don't know about you, but I've had times when I was getting in my car, I looked around and saw people and felt like the thing I need to do right now is to lock the doors on my car immediately. I'm not showing a lot of faith in those people, am I?
You're showing faith in your car is locked.
Sometimes your faith is basically the only thing you have. When you have no other options, you rely on their faith. But it is there is this interdependence of work. This picks up with faith without works is dead in verse 17. It's not that they cannot maybe coexist, but they're not giving each other life at that point. And your faith should be shaped by your works. As you do more works according to your faith will grow. So there is this, I think, a very natural view of a life lived with God. I don't think James is trying to argue how many angels can dance on the head of a pin here. He's not really going into the very finest points, perhaps, that Paul is going to, because Paul is dealing with a lot of argumentative situations. He's dealing with, to what extent do Gentile Christians have to be Jewish? And James, again, if it's the right James, kind of lays out a plan. This is how Jewish you have to be. And Paul really resists that. That's not something that Paul is comfortable with. And I think Paul is right. How Jewish do you have to be a Christian? How about 0% Jewish to be a Christian? You don't have to be circumcised. You don't have to keep kosher. You don't have to keep the Jewish holidays. You can eat whatever you want. Nothing distinctively Jewish is required to be a Christian. But things that are distinctively Jewish give us some insight sometimes into the way God relates to his people. They have some value in that sense. They have, knowing what they could eat and what they couldn't eat. I think it's very interesting. It's not something you may have guessed I don't keep kosher, but it's an interesting study. It's I think, helpful study to our faith. But he starts out with Abraham, and then he goes to kind of, in a sense, you could say a mother of our faith, but kind of a difficult mother of our faith, right? And this is one of the things when you look at the genealogies of Jesus, and they mention the women that are mentioned, they're not usually the most virtuous women in the world in the history of Scripture. They're kind of some shady ladies. Even Ruth is, in the Jewish context, kind of marginalized, kind of out there. She's a Moabitess, which means descendant of Moab, which is a relative of the Jewish people because they come from Lot, but they are also conceived in incest, right? That's how Moab came to be, Lot and his daughter. So since they come from a challenging background, a kind of an unholy, I guess you could say, background, that colors how the Jewish people would have viewed Ruth to begin with. And then to see her story unfold, that means how great Ruth really is. That shows Ruth transcend in what it means to be a Jew, because not only is Ruth this great story of faith, this great story of obedience to the law, how the law provides for this person on the fringe of the kingdom. Not only is she that story, she is in the line of David too, and thus in the line of Jesus. But Rahab is harlot. And we have our kind of contemporary views of prostitution and what we think about it and how we deal with the issue. My thinking is that it will never completely go away, that there will always be prostitution in the world. They call it the oldest profession for a reason. I mean, there's never probably been a time when there weren't women providing that accommodation to men. And I don't think there will ever be a time when on the entire planet it won't happen. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it will happen. I hope so. But in other cultures and other places, like maybe Jericho before the fall of the wall, they didn't look at prostitution quite the way we do. And maybe the people who did that, particularly in a religious context, actually were just seen as professionals. This is their service. This is what they do for the community. And if it's in the temple of their pagan faith, they're doing the work of their God. Now, that's not our way of looking at it, and I'm not advocating for that way of looking at it, but it shapes the story a little bit. It shapes our understanding of the story. If we look at the fact that maybe Rahab, Jericho's view of prostitution was different than our view of prostitution. One of my favorite, I don't know the verse, maybe y'all could look it up. One of my favorite parts of the story of Rahab is after the fall of the wall, they go into Jericho and they say, go into the house of the harlot and bring out the woman. And I think that is a great, now the Hebrew may not really support this understanding or interpretation of the passage, but in English, it's such a powerful statement as to what God does for the lives of all of us. He goes into the lives of the sinners and pulls out the human being. Just because she's a harlot doesn't mean she's not a woman anymore, and she can be restored fully to womanhood and become a part of the kingdom, but part of the family of faith, and play such an important role that eventually Jesus comes from her line. I think Rahab is a very important story, challenging story again. She is presented as an integral part to the successful conquest of Canaan. The first thing they have to do when they go into Canaan is take out Jericho. That's the first task. And the way the story unfolds, they wouldn't have done it without Rahab. She had to kind of betray her own people, not kind of, really betray her own people, but embrace the people of God. And then become a person of God, a part of the family of faith, and fully integrated into that faith. America's history in international affairs, we have had locals a lot of time betray their own people, betray their own culture, betray their own cities, their own communities for our interests. And sometimes we take care of those people. We make them Americans. And sometimes, if it's too politically difficult or whatever, too expensive, we cut them loose after they've done that. What do you think happens to them when we leave them behind in Afghanistan or Pakistan or some other place? Vietnam. What happens to the locals that help us when we pull out? Well, what Israel does is what we should do, is what anytime people align themselves with you, you need to reward that. They need to be integrated fully into the people of God. Just as Rahab was, and look what God brought about through Rahab. Okay, and as we move out of chapter 2, we'll get into chapter 3 here in just a minute. One last thing, again, from this letter, I think it's important to return to an understanding of who the original audience was. And the original audience was, Sherry says Joshua 6:22 following. So anyway, the original audience of the letter is to the 12 tribes dispersed abroad. So it's one thing to demonstrate your faith in a culture that supports that faith. It's another thing to demonstrate your faith in a culture in which you're the minority, you're the oppressed, you're the stranger. The cultural norms and values are not yours, and they're not going to be really well received. We have this huge divide in our country right now, politically, red and blue. And a lot of people, I have blue friends in red states, and I have red friends in blue states. And I can tell that their disconnect from the primary political viewpoints of, and it's like the blues are getting bluer and the reds are getting redder. They're not, and nobody's becoming purple, it doesn't seem like. So it's very difficult to be even a political minority. It's uncomfortable to be a Republican in a Democrat-run state. It's difficult to be a Democrat in a Republican-run state. Imagine being a Jew in a Greco-Roman culture, where you walk around and you see things every day that God has no approval of, that God condemns, that God has laid waste to cultures for. And it's all around you all the time. And the temptation could be just to, I'm going to hold on to my faith. I want to hold on to my belief. Whatever happens around me, I'm not going to cause any problems. I'm not going to be ultra visible with my belief. I'm not going to wear my phylacteries today, or whatever it is. But I'm not going to do the wrong things either. I'm not going to fall down that path, but I'm also not going to really do the right things. I'm not going to be an effective witness to my faith. I'm just going to have my belief. Whatever's going around me, whatever I do, it's just an accommodation of that. It doesn't have to be connected directly to my faith. What James is saying, you have to live out your faith, not just when it's convenient, not just when it's comfortable, not when everybody else around you agrees with it. When you are dispersed, when you are away from home, when you are the minority, when you are being oppressed. And I think for a lot of people, the thing that's happened the last 20 or 30 years or so is that they're for the first time experiencing what it's like to be in a cultural minority. They never really had a heart or a thought or a care for other people who were in cultural minorities before. But now that they're in it, all of a sudden, it really matters. And their views and feelings and thoughts should be valued and protected and everything. The Christians, the early church, they were always the minority. They were always living in either a Jewish world or a pagan world. And the culture was never their own. James says you got to live it out, even in those contexts. Okay, let's get into James chapter 3. I don't know how we'll be looking at this text again next week, but we'll start out by reading the first 12 verses of James 3. Let not many of you become teachers, my brethren, knowing that as such we will incur a stricter judgment. For we all stumble in many ways. If anyone does not stumble in what he says, he is a perfect man, able to bridle the whole body as well. Now, if we put the bits into the horses' mouths so that they will obey us, we direct their entire body as well. Look at the ships also, though they are so great and are driven by strong winds, they are directed by a very small rudder, wherever the inclination of the pilot desires. So also the tongue is a small part of the body, and yet it boasts of great things. See how a great forest is set aflame by such a small fire. And the tongue is a fire, the very world of iniquity. A tongue is set among our members as that which defiles the entire body, and set on fire the course of our life, and is set on fire by hell. For every species of beasts and birds, of reptiles and creatures of the sea is tamed and has been tamed by the human race. But no one can tame the tongue. It is a restless evil and full of deadly poison. With it we bless our Father, and with it we curse men who have been made in the likeness of God. From the same mouth come both blessing and cursing. My brethren, these things ought not to be this way. Does a fountain send out from the same opening both fresh and bitter water? Can a fig tree, my brethren, produce olives, or a vine produce figs? No, nor can salt water produce fresh. And it's now that time of year for our figgy pudding. Has anyone ever had a figgy pudding? I don't think it's what we're thinking. Okay. What do we think about that? Not many ought to be teachers, huh?
Verse 2, to me, goes along with the verses that talk about treating you are not a sinner. So it seems like it's says that he is a perfect man, able to upright on his soul and body, but we know that there was only the one perfect man, Jesus Christ. So therefore, as we read this, this is the goal that we will strive for, to be like Paul says here. And with the tongue, things, of course, he is a lot of trouble real fast if I'm not careful what we say.
One of the great things about women is that when you say something to them you shouldn't have said, they can repeat it back to you word for word 20 years later. They can say exactly what you said, not the gist of what you said, what you said. So that's a great thing that women have available to them. But yes, there's, it's an interesting, starting out with the idea that not many become teachers because they incur a stricter judgment. And what exactly does James mean by that? And yet, Hebrews chapter 5, verse 12 says, you ought to be teachers. By now, you ought to be teachers. And we believe in the priesthood of all believers, don't we? That everybody should be able to give a defense, an answer for what they believe. That everybody should be able to help someone come to a knowledge, a saving relationship with God through Jesus Christ.
Are those talking about the same thing though? I guess I've always been taught and thought about this as a teacher. Yes, we're to spread the word, and it's a good thing to keep in mind that when you're teaching, you need to be careful. Or when you're studying with someone, you need to be careful about what you're saying because it is going to affect their eternity. But I think here, and what you said that you by now you should be teachers, but you aren't because you're still in the milk of the word. The point of that's the point I get out of that other scripture that you're talking about is that they should be able to do more than what they're able to do, but they haven't grown like they should have, and so they're not able to do that. But again, going back to this verse, I always thought that this was about like Bible class teachers or preachers, that kind of a thing. Because that is, if you will, a position, and because it's a quote unquote position, or people look to it as a position, what you say is going to have greater influence than just a person doing one-on-one study.
They're more of an authority figure.
They would be interpreted as an authority figure, whether they were or not, but Yeah, and that's what I meant by being a physician, is it, you know?
And people look to authority people as, oh, that's gospel.
Whether they should or not, yes, yes.
Any other thoughts?
Because, it states there in the first verse, we who teach will be judged, so he's putting himself into that position. And we, myself included, we're going to put that strongly. And does that say that as a non-teacher officially teaching a group of people, does that mean I have any less responsibility? I don't think it's saying that, but it's saying if you're putting yourself up as a teacher, I think this is going back to the Jewish leadership too. And remember what was going on back then, what was going on.
A lot of early Jewish Christians had come from being rabbis or from being priests.
Or in Jesus' case, being attacked by the leadership, saying, no, you're not the Christ, you're not.
Jesus certainly judged the teachers of the Jews, didn't
He
he?
did. So that's what I'm saying, this, you look at the setting of when this was written, it kind of opens it up a little bit bigger than what maybe we look at sometimes.
And Jesus himself was judged as a rabbi, but and looking back historically, we judge James, we judge Paul, we judge Peter. I mean, I don't know how many times I've heard, particularly youth ministers, like to get up and talk about Peter shooting his mouth off or whatever, and finding fault with Peter. I don't know how many of those got up and preached the day of Pentecost too, and how many of them gave us the great confession too, and whom Jesus said, "Feed my flock," and gave the keys to the kingdom to. I mean, it's it's just it is. I mean, we ought to teach. I mean, Matthew chapter 28, the Great Commission, does that just apply to professionals or does that apply to everyone? Teaching them to observe all that I have commanded. So we should teach. We should all teach. In our context, we may not all be professionals. We may not all be. But when you are professional, you get up in front of people and you're getting paid to do it, all of a sudden, yes, you do incur a stricter judgment. That doesn't mean you're perfect. And it doesn't mean that it's fair necessarily. And it doesn't mean that judgment is going to come from God. Well, none of us have already talked about this is going to be when you stand before God, God's going to judge you more strictly. Maybe that's meant here, but I think the simplest meaning of it is that you are judged by your contemporaries, by the people around you in a way. And I think, we see there's a certain category of human beings called PKs. What are PKs?
Oh, preacher's kids?
Preacher's kids. So the judgment, we look at a lot of churches where the preacher has kids, those kids are judged very harshly by the congregation, aren't they? Well, his dad's the preacher, he should behave. And those kids, they hear their dad preach on Sunday morning, and then they see their dad as he lives at home. And no man has total control of his life. No man even has total control of what they say. So they see that disconnect all the time. Every week, their dad gets up, preaches out of the Bible, and tells people to some extent how to live. And then he doesn't live that way. Not perfectly. Not all the time. And we wonder why a lot of times so many preachers' kids don't remain faithful. We may like the preacher really well. He was raised by this wonderful preacher, and then he got out and he never came to church and he didn't care anymore and he's gone with the wind. I mean, the preacher is being strictly judged by his own children. And it's unfair to some extent, but it is very, very human. It's going to go along with it. And it's not easy. I've had one of my professors in my grad program. He was a really good preacher. And I think I've told you, every now and then he would mention his son in his sermons. And when he did, he had to pay his son $20. That's a name, image, and likeness, I guess, for using. And I think that's not a bad idea. I'm not paying Sherry every time I mention her. But they become kind of little celebrities, don't they? Whether they feel that calling or they want to be celebrities or not. You go to a congregation of, let's say, 150 people, the preacher's got 2 kids growing up. Everybody, all their eyes are on it. How does the preacher's kid treat the other kids when they're in the youth group? The other kids can run around and act like little demons and make everybody else shudder. But boy, the preacher's kid, if he doesn't put the seat down after he used the bathroom, he can be in big trouble. So some of this stricter judgment is our own just human weakness, our own hypocrisy. We can't control our kids, but boy, the preacher ought to be able to control his. And I think I can say this pretty boldly, not having had any kids, that it's not fair to judge the preacher's kids more harshly than you judge other kids. And I would warn people who are thinking about going into ministry and having children, and most of them do. Most churches want a married man with kids. That's who they want for their preacher. It's your calling. It's what you want to do. It's your vocation. It's not theirs. And yet they're going to go through it with you. You're dragging them into it as well. The wife. But at least the wife, a lot of times, is an adult, knows what she's getting into, has at least some idea. Sherry can tell you if she knew what she was really getting into or not. No.
Sometimes you have blind and other
Yeah.
things.
But when I was at Harding, there were women there who had as their goal to marry a preacher, marry a Bible major who's going to be a preacher. I'm going to be a preacher's wife. That's my lot in life. I mentioned last week Martin Luther's wife, the first preacher's wife, and how high she set the bar of what it means to be a preacher's wife. And nobody's even coming close to that. Not too many preachers' wives run their own hospital, do they? I mean, charitably, not for profit or anything. You may have some preachers' wives who are hospital administrators, but there is a trade-off. It is part of the sacrifice of going into the life that you are judged. You're judged in everything you do and say. Sometimes the negative judgments have some merit. Many times they're completely unfair, but that's life. So there is this warning, but yet we are all called to teach. And I think if we all taught more, we might be a little more gracious towards those who are doing it more often. I mean, if you've never had your words read back to you by someone who wants to bring you down, then good for you. I mean, it happens. So it is part of what's going to happen. And I think James is kind of waking us up. He's also, I think, tying it into the whole faith and works. You know, you have what you believe and what you do, and also what you say. What you say is not always what you do. You can be a son whose father tells him to go work in the field, and the son can say, "Oh, I'll be right there, Dad," and then never go. And then you can be the son that says, "No, I'm not doing it, Dad. You can't make me." And then go in and does it. And who's righteous? Who's justified? Who made their audience happier to begin with? But then who ultimately did what was called upon to be done? So it's a difficult, I think there is some distinguishment between professional preachers, full-time people who are doing it for their livelihood, and the average Joe citizen. But the more the average rank and file member of the congregation teaches, the more strictly he will be or she will be judged by the people they teach. There are people out there that are led to faith by a lay member of the congregation, and that lay member may later on turn away from the faith. And that leaves that person they converted wondering, the person who brought me to faith is now no longer a member of the church or no longer a person of faith themselves. But the goal, I think, should be always to get people to be developing, to get them off milk, to get them in a position where they are themselves becoming teachers and they are themselves incurring stricter judgment so they can bring other people along. And if the people ahead of them, some of them fall away, it's sad, but that's always been the nature of, that was something that happened in the scriptures. Paul writes about people that helped him that are no longer helping him anymore. So it's not an easily, I think it's not just this means this and that means that. If you put them together and they stay there and they struggle with one another, they wrestle, I guess you could say, they develop a dynamic tension with one another, and yet they serve us to help us grow, keep us mindful that we are being judged and that our works need to reflect our faith. And some of those works, in a sense, are our words. That the definition of works is not just what we physically do with our hands, our feet, but what we say. And out of the mouth, Jesus says, comes all these corruptive things. So, yes, ma'am.
Verse 1, let not many of you become teachers, indicate there's at least two levels of teaching because we're all commanded to be teachers. So just being teacher isn't just one level. And that was where I was getting this authority figure and all that garbage that we just talked about. But this particular teacher that he's talking about is not the commandment that we all are teachers.
Yes, but I would say that even at any level of teaching, within the people you teach, you will be judged more strictly by them. So this is true for everyone. And yet we were all called to teach. So good points. We'll come back then to talk about this a little bit more. It's a long passage to do, and we've gone way over now, so I apologize for that. But we got started late too. So thank you for your attention and your comments. And Mr. White, will you lead us in a closing prayer, please, sir?